Cast your mind back to 1868. I bet you can't. That's because 150 years have passed. Prior to then, Wombwell didn't have a cemetery. If you were sitting where you are now over a century and a half ago, you'd be sitting in the middle of a field. Instead, locals had to make their way to Darfield to bury their loved ones, but the small population of Wombwell was rapidly increasing and Darfield was feeling the pressure. In 1867, the Wombwell Burial Board purchased this large green space for £1,200. They employed an architect by the name of Thomas Dobb, as well as a group of local contractors, to form the cemetery and to build two identical Gothic chapels near what would be the main entrance. The foundation stone for the chapels was laid on Monday the 5th of August 1867 by the architect and the Reverend Henry Clayforth, who then received a commemorative trowel and mallet during the ceremony. 1 year later, in 1868, Barnsley Chronicle reported that the cemetery work had been mostly completed, and the grounds had been consecrated by the Archbishop of York on the 30th of July at around 4 p.m. Due to a delay in laying the chapel flooring, the cemetery opened on Saturday the 29th of August 1868. Locals gathered for the grand opening, and not long after, the first burial took place. After research many years ago, we believed that the first burial was an infant named Emma Sheldon. However, a recent discovery makes Thomas Wadworth the first consecrated burial in Wombwell Cemetery. If you sit on the bench near the Peace Garden, his grave is the nearest one on your left. Thomas was buried at the end of August, at only 19 years old, but the first unconsecrated burial was on the 22nd of September. This was Hannah Carr. The small building we now call the cabin at the Cemetery Road entrance was built as a hearse house to store the horse-drawn hearse when not in use. There was also a bier that was used to carry the coffin to the graveside from the chapels, which could have been stored in this building too. Our bier was found in this very chapel and was renovated by Roy Sager and his brother Barry. It's a more colourful example of the Victorian contraption used years ago. Skipping forward 10 years to May 1877, it was clear the cemetery was thriving. Walks were often taken in the summer months, and the cemetery was quoted by the clerk of the burial board as the only ground the Wombwell people had to pass a few spare hours in. With this in mind, the board set out to beautify the cemetery and splash in some colour with flowers and renovations to the chapels. The board were very proud of their cemetery, as were the locals. In 1916, more burials were taking place due to the First World War, including the burial of Alfred Flaxman, an athlete and Olympian from Wombwell. He was buried as a brave soldier in July 1916, and his funeral was well attended. Following on from Flaxman, the cricketer Roy Kilner was buried in April 1928, whose funeral was so heavily attended that the gates had to be closed and people were turned away. An Australian cricket team visited Kilner's grave a few years after the funeral to pay their respects, which also drew in huge crowds. After that, in 1951, was the greatly attended funeral of the Labour MP Frank Collindridge, followed by the devastating death of Mark Jones, former Busby Babe and captain of Manchester United Football Club, who died in the Munich air disaster in 1958. Much like Kilner, the gates were closed during Jones's funeral ceremony, as he was admired across Wombwell, Manchester and beyond. Between 1907 and 1908, the hearse house was converted into a mortuary, which is not hard to imagine if you ever sat inside there during the winter. However, we know very little of what happened in the cemetery between then and the later 1900s, when it became the victim of deprivation. The mortuary closed, as did the chapels, and all fell into dereliction. Nature took its toll on the grounds despite regular burials still taking place. An area of harmony and peace became the regular haunt for drug abusers and youths. If you take a look outside, you'll notice that the Peace Garden is missing its roof. This was due to a fire which engulfed the building and caused the roof to fall in. The whole of the interior burned away, and with no shield from the outside world, trees and shrubs rose high above the remaining walls and through the glassless windows. When we fast forward a few years, we arrive at a shocking news story. In late 2001, an elderly lady was mugged at her husband's grave, which sparked fury into Wombwell resident Mike Breton. He later formed a neighbourhood watch group, formerly known as the Cemetery Watch, which later became the Friends of Wombwell Cemetery you know of today. In the 16 years the group's been running, you'll have hopefully noticed the difference made in the cemetery from what it was. The aim is to make the cemetery a cleaner, greener, safer space for the community, a place where leisurely strolls can resume and where people can visit from miles around to see how the cemetery has changed. The mortuary was converted into a meeting room and storage facility for the Friends. The chapel that burned down is now a garden of remembrance, and the one you're sat in is a community facility to rent out and hold events in such as this. There are benches to sit on, and there are memorials for babies and the soldiers who gave their lives for us. We hope you'll agree that the cemetery has improved and flourished over the years, and that the Victorian green space has withstood the test of time through the eras to blossom into the modern day. Thank you for watching and for all of your support.